The afternoon moved like any other. People walked through the large public hall without looking up. Shoes tapped against the smooth floor. Bags rolled behind tired travelers. Some rushed, some dragged their feet, and most stared down at their phones as if the world around them did not exist. The public piano sat near the center of the space. It was not new. The wood showed signs of age, and a few keys had faded from years of use. A small sign beside it invited anyone to play. Most people had seen it before. Few paid attention anymore. A young person stopped for a moment, pressed a few random keys, laughed, then walked away. The sounds were quick and careless. A couple nearby smiled politely, but did not stop. Life kept moving. A woman with shopping bags slowed down, curious for a second, then continued on. A worker on a short break leaned against a pillar, scrolling through messages. A street cleaner passed by, pushing a cart, the wheels squeaking softly. The piano remained quiet again. This place was known for being loud but empty at the same time. Voices echoed, but no one really listened. Everyone was busy going somewhere else. Near one of the entrances, a man stood watching the flow of people. He looked like just another passerby. His clothes were plain. His shoes were clean, but not expensive looking. Nothing about him stood out. If someone had looked at him, they would forget him a second later. He carried himself calmly, not rushed, not lost, just present. He watched the piano from a distance. Not in a casual way, but with focus. His eyes stayed there longer than most. He seemed to be waiting, though, for what was not clear. Time passed. A group of friends walked by, laughing loudly. A child pulled at a parent's hand, pointing at the piano, but was gently pulled away. Another person sat down and played a short tune, stopping halfway when a mistake was made. Embarrassed, they stood up quickly and left. The man near the entrance took a small step forward. Then he stopped. He took a breath, slow and quiet. He looked around, not to be seen, but to see faces, movements, the feeling of the place. This hall reminded him of many others. Places where people crossed paths but never connected. Where moments passed unnoticed. He adjusted his sleeves slightly. His hands looked steady, but his fingers carried signs of long use. Not rough, but trained. The kind of hands that remembered things even when the mind tried to forget. He began to walk toward the piano. No one noticed at first. People were too busy with their own thoughts. He blended in easily, like he wanted to. As he got closer, he slowed down again. The bench in front of the piano was empty. The keys reflected the bright lights from above. The piano waited, patient and silent. He stood beside it for a moment. Just standing, not touching. His eyes traced the keys gently from one end to the other. Something shifted inside him, though his face stayed calm. The sounds of the hall continued around him. Footsteps, voices, announcements, echoing from above. None of it seemed to reach him now. He sat down. The bench creaked softly under his weight. Still, no one paid attention. A man sitting down at a public piano was nothing new. He placed his hands on his knees instead of the keys. He closed his eyes briefly. Not long enough to draw attention. Just long enough to breathe. Memories stirred quietly. Not loud, not sharp. Just there. This piano was not special. It was not perfectly tuned. It had seen better days. But to him, it was enough. He lifted his hands and hovered them above the keys. He did not rush. He did not test a note. He simply waited, as if listening to something only he could hear, around him. Life kept going. A couple stopped near a coffee stand, arguing softly about directions. A security guard walked past, nodding at no one in particular. Someone dropped coins, bending down to pick them up with a sigh. Then gently, he pressed the first key. The sound was soft, clear but quiet, easy to miss. A second note followed. Then another dot. At first it sounded like random notes. Nothing special. Nothing bold. Just careful sounds placed one after another, but something about it was different. A woman walking by slowed down. She did not know why. She just did. Her steps matched the pace of the music without her realizing it. The man continued. His fingers moved slowly, almost respectfully. He played as if he was speaking to the piano, not performing for anyone else. The noise of the hall did not stop, but it seemed to pull back slightly. The music slipped through the gaps, finding its way into the space between footsteps and voices. A few people glanced over, not fully stopping. Just noticing, the music grew a little stronger, not louder, but fuller. The notes connected, forming a simple melody. Not fast, not showy, honest. A teenager leaned against a wall nearby and removed one earphone. A worker paused mid-step. A couple sat down on a bench without realizing why. The man at the piano remained focused. His back was straight, but relaxed. His face showed no effort, only attention. His hands moved with memory, not thought. Each note landed where it needed to be. The piano responded the best it could. Some keys sounded slightly off, but he adjusted without pause. He knew how to listen and adapt. The melody carried warmth. It did not demand attention. It invited it. A small circle of people began to form. Not close, not crowded. Just enough to say something was happening. Whispers softened. Phones were lowered. The space changed its mood without anyone agreeing to it. The man did not look up. He did not check the crowd. He did not smile. He played for the moment, and the moment held him. Some listeners felt something stir inside them. A memory, a feeling, a calm they did not expect to find in such a place. No one knew who the man was. No one wondered yet. Right now, he was just the person at the piano, and somehow, that was enough. The afternoon light shifted slightly through the high windows. Dust floated in the air, catching the glow. The piano music moved gently through it all, like it had always belonged there, for the first time in a long while. People were not rushing, they were listening, and the ordinary afternoon was no longer ordinary. The man at the piano continued to play. His hands moved with quiet confidence, each note deliberate, each pause thoughtful. The small melody he began with now began to take shape, turning into something richer, warmer. The space around him seemed to slow down, even though people still walked past and announcements echoed from the ceiling speakers. It was as if the music had created its own little world inside the busy hall. Some people who had only glanced at the piano before now stopped more seriously. A young woman carrying a bag of groceries leaned against a pillar, listening, her tired eyes softening. She had been rushing through the hall, thinking about errands, meetings, and calls she had to make, but the music held her attention. Her hand rested on her bag, forgotten for a few minutes. She had no idea why this music made her pause, but she did not want to leave. A man in a uniform, walking past with a tray of cleaning supplies, slowed his pace. He stopped for a moment, tilting his head slightly, letting the notes reach him. His face softened. He did not expect to feel anything in a place like this, but the melody stirred something inside him. Something he could not name. A memory, perhaps, or just the comfort of a sound that reminded him of quiet afternoons he had. Long forgotten, the piano player did not look at the audience. He did not need to. He played not for recognition, not for applause, not for anyone else. He played because the music was something inside him that had to come out. His fingers moved with precision and fluidity. Every note he struck had weight, meaning, and honesty. Even the keys that were slightly off in tone were coaxed into a delicate harmony by the way he touched them. A small boy, holding the hand of his parent, stopped a few feet away. His eyes were wide. He tilted his head, unsure if it was okay to stay or if he should move along. He had never seen someone play like this before. The notes seemed to dance in the air, light and playful, yet deep and serious at the same time. He tugged at his parent's hand, pointing at the piano, and the parent, curious themselves, allowed him to watch for a moment. Neither moved, frozen in a silent agreement that the music was worth waiting for. The man at the piano shifted slightly in his seat. He had not intended to draw attention, but the presence of these few listeners did not bother him. The music, after all, was not about them, yet he felt an unspoken connection through the notes. The melody changed subtly. weaving in minor chords that gave it a hint of sadness, a quiet ache, as if telling a story without words. A teenager leaning against the wall nearby pulled out a notebook and began sketching. The pencil moved fast over the page, but not without care. He had been wandering the hall, bored, scrolling through his phone, thinking he had nothing to occupy him, when the music caught him off guard. It felt like the melody had a story and he needed to capture a piece of it. Even if he could not name the feelings it evoked, the crowd grew slowly, imperceptibly. Not many people, but enough to notice that the piano, the music, and the man were creating something unusual in the space. Whispers started among them. Some asked quietly who he was, but no one seemed to know. The answers were simple guesses. Perhaps a musician passing through. Perhaps a street performer. Perhaps someone who simply loved music. No one guessed the truth, and the truth made no difference. The music shifted again. What had started as a gentle tune now became slightly faster, more flowing, almost like a conversation. Each hand moved independently but harmoniously. One hand told a story, the other hand responded. The notes rose and fell, pulling at the listener's emotions, making them lean in a little closer, making them slow down in a place where speed and hurry were the norm. An elderly woman, leaning on her cane, approached carefully. She had been walking through the hall, her movements slow and measured, thinking of her day, her errands, her loneliness perhaps. The music stopped her. She smiled softly, almost to herself, as if the piano had reminded her of something long forgotten, a memory of childhood, a parent, a long-ago piano teacher. She listened without a word, letting the music wash over her. The man at the piano did not glance around, but he felt the presence of people. Not in a superficial way, not in a way that would distract him, but in the subtle awareness that his music had reached others. He continued, letting his fingers tell the story he had carried inside for years. Each note was intentional, each pause filled with thought. Even the mistakes, rare as they were, seemed to belong to the melody, adding a human touch to the performance. A middle-aged man, sitting on a bench, eating a sandwich, stopped mid-bite. He had been thinking about his work, his responsibilities, the meetings and calls waiting for him, but the music pulled him out of his thoughts. He listened, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. The melody spoke to something familiar, something he could not quite articulate. It was comfort and longing at the same time, and he felt lighter, as if the hall itself had slowed down to give him a moment of peace. The piano's sound traveled. It filled corners, crept into spaces where people had not noticed silence before. Travelers passing by with luggage paused, just for a beat to hear the notes. Teenagers with headphones pulled one side off to listen. Shopkeepers at nearby stalls leaned out briefly. Even the staff, busy with cleaning or announcements, seemed to soften under the influence of the music. No one clapped yet. No one approached. The music was enough. It demanded no acknowledgement. It existed purely for itself, and in doing so, it gave those who heard it something unexpected: presence, tension, connection. A reminder that in the middle of a busy day, there could be beauty, stillness, and emotion. The man's playing began to take on more complexity. Patterns intertwined, melodies overlapped. It was no longer a simple accompaniment. It was storytelling. The audience, small as it was, could feel the shift. The music was personal, yes, but it also spoke to shared human experiences. The loneliness, the joy, the small victories, the hidden sadness, all of it came through without a single word. A young couple, walking hand in hand, stopped. They had been arguing quietly about directions, about something small that felt big at the moment. They listened without speaking. Their hands remained clasped, but their tension eased. The music reminded them that there were other things, small moments of beauty that could exist even amidst disagreements. They smiled at each other faintly. A quiet acknowledgement shared between them. A security guard walking his usual route paused to stand beside a column. He did not usually take breaks. He did not usually stop to listen. But something about the performance made him forget his routine. His eyes softened. His hands relaxed. He did not check his watch or his phone. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply experience something beautiful without any expectations. The pianist's hands moved faster now, but still with control. The melody grew more expressive, adding subtle variations, flourishes, small bursts of emotion that caught listeners off guard. Some eyes glistened, some brows furrowed, not in confusion but in focus. They were listening to something they did not expect to feel in a place they did not expect to feel it. A man carrying a child on his shoulders stopped near the back of the small gathering. The child looked curious, wide-eyed. The man tilted his head toward the piano and let the child observe. The little one's fingers waved in the air, trying to mimic the notes. The father smiled quietly, realizing this music had already started creating a memory, one that would stay with the child long after they left the hall. The atmosphere began to feel lighter. The hurried pace of the hall seemed softened. People walked slower. Conversations hushed. Even the usual announcements over the loudspeaker became background noise compared to the story. Unfolding at the piano, the pianist did not pause, did not break the flow. He leaned slightly into the music, feeling it as much as producing it. His eyes occasionally flickered open, but only briefly, scanning the hall with awareness. He noticed the subtle reactions, the tiny shifts, but he did not play for them. He played because it was necessary. Because the music lived inside him and demanded release. A young woman with a stroller stopped near the edge of the small crowd. Her baby cooed at the notes, kicking tiny legs in rhythm. She smiled softly, looking down at her child. The music, simple yet complex, connected across generations. The same notes touched an adult, a teenager, a child, and even the elderly. It was universal, human, alive. No one spoke. There were no words, no instructions, no introductions. Just the music, just the piano, just a man who had decided that this moment, this space, this audience, small as it was, deserved honesty. The notes filled the air and lingered after being struck, leaving a warmth that did not demand anything but acknowledgement. The melody continued to grow, but the man remained calm, measured. His hands moved with purpose, never frantic, never hesitant. Each note built upon the last, forming a bridge between him and the listeners, between the past and the present. People felt they were not intruding. They were witnessing something intimate, private, and yet shared. Time became irrelevant. The hall, the footsteps, the announcements, the passing travelers all faded into the background. There was only the music. There was only the piano. There was only the man who played it, and the handful of people who had, for a few minutes, stopped the world to listen. And in that moment, though no one spoke, though no one moved closer, though the man's identity remained unknown, something remarkable had already begun. The ordinary hall had been transformed. Not by grandeur, not by spectacle, not by fame, but by something far simpler and more profound: presence, honesty, and human connection through the language of music. The music flowed like a quiet river, carrying everything around it along with it. People who had been walking hurriedly through the hall now seemed to exist in a different time. The notes were soft at first, almost shy, but gradually grew stronger, more expressive, yet never harsh. They carried emotion not for attention, but because emotion demanded to be shared. The man at the piano played with a sense of freedom, came only after years of practice and experience. His hands moved with confidence and delicacy at the same time. Every note had meaning, as though each key held a memory, a story, a thought that he could not put into words. His fingers brushed the keys lightly at times, and at others, pressed with gentle insistence. The music had a voice of its own, but it was his hands that gave it life. A woman carrying a folder of documents slowed down as she passed. She had been thinking about deadlines, meetings, and responsibilities. Her mind was a storm of tasks, but the music pulled her attention to something else entirely. She stopped near a column, holding her folder close, and just listened. She felt a calm she had not known for months. Her shoulders loosened. Her face softened. The The music seemed to reach into a corner of her heart that she had left untouched for a long time. A young boy, no older than 8, had been tugging at his parents' hand, trying to move forward. But the rhythm of the piano caught his imagination. He tugged less, tilted his head, and let his small fingers mimic the air as if he were playing invisible keys. The parent noticed but said nothing, allowing the child to be caught in the moment. The music had taken the ordinary space and turned it into a place where imagination could breathe. The melody shifted again. Notes that were soft and comforting now carried a subtle sadness, a longing that made those who listened pause even more. The music did not ask questions, and it did not answer them. It simply existed as an expression of the man's emotions, honest and raw. People began to feel it inside themselves, connecting it to experiences they had almost forgotten. A middle-aged man standing near a bench folded his arms and let himself lean back against the wall. He had been in a rush to meet someone, always thinking about the next step, the next call, the next task. But now, the sound of the piano invited him to stop, even if only for a few minutes. The notes seemed to wrap around him, gentle yet firm, telling him that slowing down was not weakness, but a gift. The pianist's eyes occasionally flickered to the small gathering around him. He did not play for them, but he could feel their presence. There was a subtle acknowledgement in his posture, in the way his fingers moved. The music reached them before words could, creating a silent conversation that needed no voice. The piano itself, worn and old, responded beautifully to his touch. Each key, even though slightly faded or stubborn, released its sound with clarity. The imperfections of the instrument added to the music's authenticity. It was not perfect, and it did not pretend to be. It was alive, human, and honest. A young woman with earbuds in her ears had stopped mid-step. She removed one earbud, curious. She had been listening to a playlist, focused on other things. But something about this live sound, imperfect yet moving, demanded her attention. She tilted her head, eyes following the pianist's hands. Her expression softened as the melody wrapped around her thoughts. The crowd grew slowly, naturally, without anyone calling attention to the performance. It was small but diverse. Elderly people, teenagers, workers on breaks, parents with children, all drawn together by the invisible thread of the music. Some of them had come closer. Others maintained distance but did not move away. Everyone felt it was theirs to witness, yet it was shared. The music became more intricate. Chords intertwined. Melodies overlapped. There were sudden, gentle crescendos that startled no one but caught the heart. The notes danced between joy and sadness, between hope and reflection. It was not a performance in the traditional sense. There were no cameras, no stage lights, no expectation. Just a man, a piano, and the raw power of music connecting strangers. A child sitting in a stroller began to coo at the sounds. The mother glanced down, smiling, realizing that even the youngest were captivated by the beauty unfolding. The music had the power to reach across generations. Speaking a universal language that needed no translation, the man's fingers flew over the keys with moments of speed, then slowed again to draw out individual notes. The shifts were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they carried a story within them. People who listened felt the narrative, even if they could not name it. It was a story of human experience, longing, memory, connection, quiet joy. A man leaning against a pillar had been skeptical at first. He had walked past, assuming it was just another passerby making noise. But now, standing still, he realized he had been wrong. The music was deliberate. It was purposeful. It was real. He found himself tapping a foot, unconsciously matching the rhythm. He felt a small smile appear on his face. The pianist did not pause for reaction. He did not look for approval. He did not seek acknowledgement. He played as though the world had narrowed down to this moment, to these keys, to this melody. The music was his language, and anyone who listened was invited in, quietly, respectfully, without pressure. A teenager seated on a nearby bench had been sketching earlier. Now, their pencils slowed. They had captured shapes and lines that reflected the melody, but the deeper emotion the music carried could not be drawn. They looked up, eyes soft, fingers still on the pencil, but now just observing. Absorbing the feelings instead of trying to reproduce them. A small group of workers passing by paused, whispering quietly to one another. None of them knew the pianist. None of them expected this moment. But the music stopped them in their tracks. It demanded nothing, and yet gave everything. Their conversation faded as they were drawn into the atmosphere. Feeling a shared, unspoken sense of calm and awe, the melody shifted again, this time more playful. Light, airy notes danced across the piano, inviting smiles, laughter, small sighs of relief from those listening. The sadness of the previous chords was not forgotten, but the new notes brought balance. The music reflected life, moments of heaviness followed by moments of lightness. Always moving, always changing, never static. An elderly man, who had been standing near the back, rested his hands on the handle of his cane. He closed his eyes and listened, feeling the sound in his chest. The music reminded him of something he had once loved, long ago. He smiled softly to himself, thankful for the chance to remember and to feel alive in this brief, unexpected way. The pianist's body moved subtly with the music. His shoulders shifted slightly, his head tilted at moments. He breathed in rhythm with the melody. It was a quiet, unconscious display of immersion. He was not performing. He was existing inside the music, and by doing so, he invited others to exist there with him. A mother watching her child in the stroller found herself holding her breath at times, caught in the emotion. She glanced around at others, noticing the range of reactions, tears in one person's eyes, a small smile on another, heads tilting in curiosity, hands folded in stillness. The music had created an invisible community, a group of strangers bound together by something beyond sight or speech. The notes swelled slightly, then softened again. Each shift was like breathing, natural and necessary. The man at the piano was not rushing or forcing. He was allowing the music to guide him. The pauses between phrases carried weight as much as the notes themselves, giving the listener space to feel, to reflect, to connect. A young boy tugged at his parent's sleeve, whispering softly about the beautiful sounds. The parent nodded, smiling, not interrupting. The moment was fragile and fleeting. They both understood that it could not be captured fully, only experienced. Even the hall itself seemed different. The usual echoes and noise of footsteps, announcements, and chatter became a gentle backdrop to the performance. The environment adjusted without thought. The music filled every corner, softened every harsh sound, and brought warmth to a space that often felt cold and impersonal. The pianist continued, allowing his hands to explore the full range of the piano. Low, resonant notes grounded the melody. High, sparkling notes added brightness and energy. Patterns weaved together with subtle variations, as though each phrase was a conversation with the previous one. It was music alive, breathing, unfolding in real time. A group of teenagers leaning against a wall had been scrolling through their phones. One glanced up and paused. Another followed. Soon all of them had put their devices away. Their faces softened, their eyes focused, their movements slowed. They had been pulled into a shared human experience, unaware of how hungry they had been for it. The music had a way of connecting hearts silently. No one spoke. No one forced recognition. Yet each listener felt something profoundly personal. It was empathy expressed through sound. It was memory stirred without words. It was emotion made tangible by simple, honest melodies. The pianist's fingers slowed for a moment, hovering over the keys. He allowed a pause, letting the sound linger in the air. Listeners held their breath. The silence was not empty. It was full of feeling. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had happened in these few minutes. The stopping, the noticing, the sharing, the connecting, the hall. Once a place of hurried footsteps and distracted faces had become a sanctuary. People no longer moved with urgency. They simply were. And for a few minutes, that was enough. The music began to slow. Not abruptly, not jarring, but gradually, like the sun dipping behind clouds at the end of a long day. The melody that had captured the attention of the hall for so long now softened, stretching the last notes like a gentle sigh. The pianist's hands moved more deliberately, lingering on keys just long enough for the sound to fill every corner of the space. People noticed. The subtle change in pace drew them closer, not physically, but emotionally. They leaned in without realizing it, holding their breath as if afraid that the end of the music would break the spell that had formed around them. For some, it was a memory resurfacing. For others, it was simply a reminder that beauty could exist even in the middle of an ordinary day. The pianist did not pause immediately. He let the final chords resonate, allowing them to hang in the air like droplets of water suspended before falling. He closed his eyes briefly, as though listening to the echoes he had created. His face remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his expression. A sense that the music was not just being played, but felt deeply. Personally, the crowd around him stirred slightly, almost imperceptibly at first. People shifted on benches, adjusted their posture, and glanced at one another. Some smiled softly, some wiped at the corners of their eyes. None spoke. None applauded. It was not time for that yet. There was a shared understanding that what had just happened was delicate and important, and they wanted to honor it quietly then. One person in the back, a man who had been watching from a distance, whispered a question to someone nearby. "Do you know who he is?" No one answered at first. They shook their heads slightly, uncertain. Some speculated quietly. Perhaps he was a street musician. Perhaps he was a teacher. Perhaps he was a traveler with time to spare and a love for music. The guesses were many, but none felt certain. There was a mystery surrounding him, and that mystery only added to the depth of the moment. The pianist finally lifted his head. His eyes scanned the small crowd, but not in search of approval or recognition. He looked as though he were acknowledging their presence, recognizing that they had shared something extraordinary, however brief. There was humility in his gaze, but also quiet pride. The kind that comes from years of dedication and practice. The kind that is earned silently. A woman in her 30s, holding a shopping bag in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, stepped forward hesitantly. She had been drawn to the piano from the first note, and now she wanted to speak. "That was beautiful," she said softly. Her voice carried wonder, not exaggeration. It was sincere. The pianist nodded slightly, but did not respond immediately. He seemed to be savoring the last vibrations of the notes he had played, letting them settle in the hall, in the people, in himself. The crowd watched in a hushed curiosity, sensing that something more was about to unfold. Then, a teenager from the small group sitting on a nearby bench spoke, his voice trembling slightly. You play like a professional. Are you a musician?" The pianist smiled faintly, a small, almost secret smile. He shook his head. "I was once," he said quietly. His words were calm, but they carried a weight that made everyone listen more closely. "A long time ago, I studied music seriously. Life took me on another path, but the music stayed with me." The crowd's reaction shifted. People leaned in subtly, not just to hear the words, but to understand. There was something human and relatable in his honesty. The notion that someone could carry a passion for so long, quietly, without fanfare or recognition, resonated deeply. A man standing near the back, who had been watching from a distance, spoke up cautiously. "So, you're wealthy?" The question was tentative, awkward, but honest. People were beginning to piece together the subtle clues in his appearance and his presence, and the quiet confidence with which he had played. The pianist's smile deepened slightly. "Yes," he said, "I have been fortunate. But wealth is not what matters here. Music matters. And sharing it, even for a few minutes, that is worth more than anything else." There was a pause. The crowd absorbed this quietly. They realized they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just because of his skill, but because of the humility and humanity behind it. The man they had assumed to be ordinary, perhaps even invisible, was in fact someone who had lived a life far beyond what anyone could guess. Yet he had chosen to sit at this old, worn piano in a crowded hall, not for attention, not for recognition, but simply to play, to share, to connect. A young mother, holding her child, whispered to the woman beside her, "It's amazing. He could have been anywhere, but he's here." Words were soft, but full of awe. It was the sense of presence that mattered, the way someone with a life of opportunity could choose simplicity, honesty, and music over grandeur or performance. The pianist looked around, eyes settling briefly on each person. "I wanted to play because sometimes we forget what it feels like to be human," he said. His voice was low but steady. To stop rushing, to feel, to connect. Not everyone has time for that every day. But here now, we can. The words resonated with the crowd. They nodded silently. Some moved in ways subtle, yet noticeable. A hand touched a shoulder gently. Eyes met across the hall, a small understanding passing between strangers. Music had created a bridge, but now words confirmed the truth. They were connected. Briefly, beautifully, unexpectedly, one of the young people in the crowd finally asked what many had wondered. "Why here? Why this piano? Why this hall?" The pianist leaned back slightly, thoughtful. "Because this place, it's full of people. People going somewhere, doing something. Life moves fast here, and yet, even for a moment, we can slow down. Even for a moment, we can feel something together. This piano. It's ordinary, but it can carry extraordinary moments. That is why I chose it." There was a quiet admiration in the air. People realized that this had not been a random choice. The man had not stumbled upon the piano by accident. He had chosen it deliberately, his understanding that ordinary places often hide the most extraordinary experiences. A security guard, who had been observing silently, spoke up. "You're not just a musician. You're someone who understands people. The way you played it wasn't for yourself. It was for all of us." The pianist nodded. "Music is a language we all understand, whether we know it or not. I play for myself, yes. But I also play for anyone who will listen, anyone who is willing to pause. And sometimes, that is enough." A young woman, who had been sitting quietly near the piano the entire time, finally asked the question on everyone's mind. "But your life. You could have done anything. Why hide? Why play here quietly without anyone knowing who you are?" He smiled, a soft, gentle expression that carried both warmth and humility. "Because fame, recognition, they can be distractions. They can make music about ego rather than feeling. Here, now. The music is honest. The moment is honest. That is all I need." People listened, captivated. The realization hit them all at once. This man, wealthy, accomplished, and capable of grandeur, had chosen simplicity. He had chosen humanity. He had chosen connection over status, feeling over recognition. It was rare, almost unbelievable, and yet here it was, in front of them, real and undeniable. A small applause began to rise, tentative at first, then growing louder. But the pianist raised a hand gently, smiling, and the crowd quieted immediately. "No need for applause," he said softly. "If you want to remember anything from today, remember this. The music is not mine. It belongs to anyone who listens, anyone who feels it. Let it stay with you quietly, and that will be enough." Out. The crowd nodded, understanding the meaning behind the words. It was not humility for show. It was honesty, and it resonated deeply. For a few minutes, they had been part of something larger than themselves, and now they carried it forward, silently in their hearts. A young boy whispered to his parent, "He's special, isn't he?" The parent nodded. "Yes," they said, "but so are we for listening." The simple exchange captured the essence of what had happened. The music had connected people, revealed hidden emotions, and reminded them of their shared humanity. The pianist stood slowly, brushing his hands gently over the last few keys, letting the sound fade naturally. He looked around one last time, making eye contact with several people, acknowledging their presence without needing to speak further. There was gratitude in his eyes, not for recognition, but for the chance to share, to give, to connect. He walked away quietly, blending into the crowd. No fanfare, no announcement, no attention-seeking. Just a man who had played from the heart, leaving behind a ripple that would linger long after he was gone. The hall remained quiet for a few moments, as if holding its breath, reluctant to break the spell. Then, slowly, people began to move. Conversations resumed. Footsteps echoed once more. Announcements continued overhead. But nothing felt quite the same. Something had shifted. The ordinary space had been touched by something extraordinary. People glanced at the piano one last time, noticing the worn keys, the small bench, the faint reflection of light on the polished wood. It was the same piano it had always been, and yet it had carried something far beyond its simple form. The music, the presence, the honesty of the moment had transformed it into something unforgettable. And in that quiet aftermath, everyone knew something true. They had witnessed not just music, but humanity in its purest form. A reminder that greatness can be quiet. That wealth, status, and recognition are not what define a person. That simple acts like playing a piano in a busy hall can touch countless lives if done with sincerity and heart. The moment would fade, eventually. Life would continue as it always did. But for those who had stopped, listened, and felt, it had left an imprint. A subtle shift in perspective. A reminder that connection is possible, even in the busiest, most ordinary places, and somewhere in the crowd, eyes met, small smiles were exchanged. And hearts carried forward the memory of an ordinary afternoon turned extraordinary. All because one man chose to play from the heart. The hall returned to its usual rhythm, but it felt different. People walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, and even the echoes seemed warmer. The piano sat quietly in the corner, unassuming, its keys now still, yet still carrying the faint memory of every note that had passed through them. The man who had played had gone, disappearing into the flow of everyday life, leaving behind something invisible yet powerful. Some lingered longer, unwilling to leave. The woman with the shopping bag, the young mother with her child, the elderly man with his cane, they all paused by the piano, each touching the worn edges, imagining the hands that had played it. They felt a quiet gratitude. It was not about seeing the pianist again. It was about recognizing the gift that had been shared, a reminder of the beauty that exists quietly in the world. Waiting for those willing to notice, the young boy who had mimicked the notes in the air stayed a little longer too. His parent watched him smiling, realizing that this was more than just music. It was an experience. A spark had been lit in the boy, a memory he might carry forever without knowing why it mattered so much. Small gestures like that can change your life in ways we don't immediately see, back in their offices, at home, or on their way to the next errand. People carried fragments of the music with them. A melody hummed quietly in someone's head while they made coffee. A chord lingered as someone walked through a crowded street. A rhythm softly tapped against the surface of someone's thoughts as they waited at a bus stop. None of them could explain exactly why it affected them so deeply, only that it had. The man at the piano, now a few blocks away, walked slowly through the city streets. He felt no rush. The act of sharing, however brief, had lifted something inside him. It was not about recognition or thanks. It was about knowing that a simple act of piano, a few notes, a few minutes of honesty could reach into the hearts of people he would never know. That was enough. That always had been enough. A security guard, returning to his routine, replayed the music in his mind. He smiled at random moments during his shift, catching himself humming fragments of a tune he had only just heard. It was strange how something so ephemeral could feel so permanent. It reminded him to notice the small, fleeting moments of life, to recognize the subtle gifts that appear unexpectedly at a nearby cafe. The young woman with her earbuds out shared a quiet smile with the barista. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Something had shifted in her perspective. The mundane, the routine, the ordinary tasks of life felt softer somehow, infused with possibility. It was as if the music had reminded her that life itself was made of small, beautiful moments often unnoticed. The mother with the stroller continued her walk, feeling a strange, tender connection with her child. The baby kicked and cooed along to the rhythm that lingered in her mind, and she found herself laughing quietly at the thought. Life was chaotic, unpredictable. exhausting at times, yet in the midst of it, there were glimpses of magic, and she realized she had witnessed one. Even the elderly man, who had rested on his cane while listening, returned to his apartment with a lighter step. The memory of the notes lingered in his chest, a warmth that reminded him of long past days, of people he had loved, of music that had been part of his life long ago. He had not expected to feel such emotion in a public hall, yet it had arrived, unbidden and unforgettable. Some of the teenagers, once glued to their phones, now exchanged quiet looks and soft smiles. They had been pulled into the moment without realizing it, reminded that the world contains more than screens, notifications, and endless scrolling. There was beauty, mystery, and connection just beyond their fingertips. If they only paused long enough to notice it, days later, in offices, schools, and homes across the city, people found themselves recalling the piano performance at unexpected moments. One person hummed a fragment during a stressful meeting, and it brought a calm that surprised them. Another replayed the memory of the melody in their mind while cleaning, feeling a subtle joy that lingered far longer than they anticipated. The music had seeped into their consciousness, leaving a quiet but permanent imprint. For the pianist, experience was equally meaningful, though he did not think of it as performance. He walked through the city observing faces, noticing the small gestures that indicated life continuing, and he felt quietly satisfied. There was a beauty in these ordinary moments, the way people carried on, smiled, struggled, loved, and endured. Sharing a moment of music had reminded him, that even fleeting experiences can have profound impact. At the hall, the piano remained in its corner, silent, waiting for the next person to sit. It seemed ordinary again, yet it now held the weight of what had occurred. The keys, worn from use, carried echoes of human emotion, joy, sadness, reflection, hope. The hall itself seemed different, subtly transformed, as though the brief encounter had infused it with a lingering presence. A janitor cleaning the hall noticed this subtle change. He paused for a moment, listening to the echoes that lingered, feeling that something remarkable had happened in a place that had always seemed ordinary. There was a quiet smile on his face as he realized that beauty does not always announce itself, it simply exists. It's waiting for someone willing to notice. Weeks passed, but the story of that day quietly spread. People mentioned it in conversations, shared it with friends and family, each retelling carrying a fragment of the original magic. They described the music, the atmosphere, the strange humility of the pianist, and the unusual way it had affected them. Each account was different, colored by personal memory, but all carried the same essence. Something extraordinary had occurred in a place that seemed ordinary. For some, the memory became a kind of talisman, a source of comfort during difficult days. They would think back to that moment and find calm, courage, or inspiration. It reminded them to look for beauty, to pause, to connect. It reminded them that even brief encounters could change perception, mood, and occasionally life itself. The pianist continued to live quietly. He did not seek fame, recognition, or even acknowledgement. His act had not been for publicity. It had been for honesty, for connection, for the simple joy of expressing music. And yet, in choosing to give, he had changed more than he realized. People remembered. People carried the memory forward. People shared it in ways small and meaningful. That was the quiet reward. One day, long after the event, a young girl visiting the hall with her parent paused by the piano. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, imagining the hands that had played there before. Her parent smiled, noting the wonder in her eyes. They spoke quietly about how sometimes ordinary places can hold extraordinary moments, and the girl nodded. Sensing something she could not yet explain, the city itself seemed subtly altered, though not in any visible way. People who had been present that day moved through the streets with a little more awareness, a little more patience, a little more appreciation for the quiet beauty around them. The piano, the hall, and the memory of the performance had created ripples that extended far beyond the initial moment, touching lives indirectly, yet profoundly. And in those ripples, the essence of what had occurred remained, the reminder that humanity, connection, and kindness exist even in the smallest acts. That a few minutes of honesty, of presence, of shared emotion can leave a lasting impression on countless people. That even in a world that moves quickly, people are capable of noticing, of feeling, and of carrying forward moments of pure beauty. The man who had played walked alone through the city streets at dusk. The lights reflected softly on the wet pavement, and he felt a quiet contentment. He had shared something true, something honest, something that had reached into hearts without words or explanation. The memory of that day and the responses it had evoked stayed with him in a calm, gentle way. He knew that his music had found a home not in fame or fortune, but in the hearts of those who had paused to listen. People, in their own lives, continued to recall him sometimes. They remembered the quiet strength of his presence, the honesty of his music, the way it had connected strangers and reminded them of the simple, essential beauty of life. They carried the memory with them in moments of joy, in moments of difficulty, and even in moments of quiet solitude. The performance had become a small, permanent part of their inner world. And though the pianist remained unknown to most, anonymous in the crowd, he had achieved something rare and precious. He had reminded people that greatness does not need to be loud. Recognition does not need to be public, and the simplest acts of honesty and connection can have the deepest, most lasting impact. The memory of that ordinary day transformed into something extraordinary. It became a quiet legend in the hearts of those who had been present. A reminder that life's most meaningful moments are often unexpected, small, and shared quietly. And in this way, the music lived on. Not just in the piano, not just in the notes, but in every heart it had touched, continuing to ripple outward, shaping perception, inspiring connection, and reminding all who remembered that humanity, in its purest form, is beautiful, fleeting, and unforgettable.